This is John Smith. John is the youngest of 3 children. John's older siblings attend the same primary school he is about to begin kindergarten at. The Smith family has a reputation amongst the school and the wider community of being troublemakers who dislike school. Even before his first day of kindergarten, John has been labelled as just another one of the Smith kids. Coming from a low socio-economic area, the Smith kids regularly attend school in partial or dirty uniform and utilise the school's breakfast club almost every morning. Meet Mr. Parker. Mr. Parker is a first-year graduate teacher who has been assigned to teach John's kindergarten class this year. Whilst attending staff development days during the school holidays, Mr. Parker began conversing with other teachers about the students in his class. As soon as John's name was mentioned, several of Mr. Parker's colleagues laughed and wished him luck. These teachers went on to explain that John was one of the Smith kids, agitators who didn't care about their education and only attend school to disrupt other students' learning. Mr. Parker was advised that the best and only way to deal with John was to remove him from the classroom and send him to the principal's office as soon as the slightest issue occurred. Those Smith kids are a product of their environment. Their parents don't care about education or their children's well-being. They're a menace, Mr. Parker overheard one of his colleagues saying. As a result, Mr. Parker was worried about John and his own ability to deal with a child who causes so many issues. He began to develop strategies and plans to deal with John. After deliberating these strategies and plans for a while, Mr. Parker began to reflect on the theories he had learnt at university and his own personal pedagogical philosophy. He began to reflect on the notion of deficit discourse, where people make unfair, preconceived assumptions of other people based on what society has told them. It was at that moment Mr. Parker realised himself and his fellow staff members had subjected John to deficit discourse. After this realisation, Mr. Parker began to conduct research regarding deficit discourse and the implementation of turnaround pedagogies in his teaching. As the first day of school approached, Mr. Parker had altered his initial mindset regarding John and actively disparaged any assumptions he had previously heard. Once worried about dealing with this student, Mr. Parker was now eager to meet John for himself. Mr. Parker greeted his students and their parents enthusiastically as they walked into the classroom. As the students began to get settled, Mr. Parker approached several parents, including John's father, to organise a meeting for the following afternoon. Across the course of his first day, Mr. Parker consciously took note of John and observed that he was an extremely creative boy, with a particular interest in books and reading. During his meeting with Mr. Smith, Mr. Parker found out that he had lost his job as a mechanic 18 months ago after injuring his shoulder in a motorcycle accident and had struggled to secure or maintain any employment as a result. Mrs. Smith was a hard-working woman who was employed as a nurse at the local hospital. She always took any overtime offered to her each week in order to earn extra money to support her family. Over the past 18 months, money had become a serious concern for the Smith family, with regular medical bills for Mr. Smith's ongoing treatment and the cost of living. This family was struggling significantly. Mr. Smith continued to confide in Mr. Parker. With his chronic shoulder pain and his wife working long hours to provide for the family, the older Smith children were often left to fend for themselves. This resulted in them getting themselves into a decent amount of trouble both at school and in the community. It became evident to Mr. Parker that Mr. and Mrs. Smith valued education and would do anything to ensure their children were provided with opportunities for future success. Following his meeting with Mr. Smith, Mr. Parker began to develop and enhance strategies that would focus on John's strengths and interests, such as reading, rather than his deficits. Implementation of a turnaround pedagogy seeks to successfully integrate each student's abilities as a result of their experiences into each given lesson. Utilising this turnaround pedagogy in the classroom will not only enable Mr. Parker to identify and target the way his students learn, but also allow him to establish relationships with each student in his class as he begins to gain an understanding of the content, the prior skills, knowledge and cultural and linguistic resources of their virtual school bags. This experience has shown Mr. Parker that by disregarding preconceived assumptions and deficit discourse of his students, he is enabled to integrate rich and meaningful pedagogy that will not only benefit John's academic achievements, but the academic achievements of all students in his class. From this moment, Mr. Parker made a conscious decision to never let societal labels or students' deficits influence his judgment, but rather acknowledge the achievements and virtual school bags to develop holistic learning experiences.